Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being at the Thursday, April 16th, 2020 Montgomery County Council meeting. The first item that we have is general business, and Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements?
Yes, we do. Good morning, President Katz. We have one announcement. The Council is seeking applicants for the Montgomery County Planning Board. The deadline has been extended to Friday, April 17th, tomorrow, at 5 p.m. We also have a few addendum items. We are adding 1.5A, an introduction special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, NDA, $100,000 for COVID-19 response manufacturing personal protective equipment. Source of funds is general fund reserves. Lead sponsor is the County Council, as requested by Council members Reamer and Albornoz. The public hearing action is scheduled for 4/21/2020 at 1:30 p.m. We have another special appropriation, 1.5B, introduction, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, $500,000, for the purchase of face coverings and other personal protective equipment. Source of funds, general funds reserves. Lead sponsors, the County Council, as requested by Council members Reamer and Albornoz. We have deleted a call for bills of final reading, 3.5, the expedited bill 1720, the carry-out bag tax suspension. That is all, President Katz.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to go into our discussion for FY21, the operating budget highlights and approach.
President Katz, we did want to do the introductions first of the two special appropriations.
Oh, I'm sorry. She just mentioned them, and therefore I should also do that. Yes. So for 1.5A, there's an introduction, as was just explained, for the special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget for the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, MCEDC, non-departmental account, NDA, and $100,000 for COVID-19 response, manufacturing personal protective equipment. Source of fundings, the general fund reserves. And Councilmember Reamer would like to speak.
Thank you, Council President. This item and the next item are related to the personal protective equipment that medical responders, frontline workers, and our residents need. I did want to note on the next item, although I suppose it's out of order to comment on it now, but we're actually going to reduce the requested appropriation amount. But on this item, we are seeking to create an economic development grant fund for local companies, local makers to begin producing the equipment that we need. And we've been working with the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation to design a program, and they are going to fund this program as well from their budget, as well as seek private funders as well. So the anticipation here is helping our residents who are facing hardship in the economy right now to start businesses that are relevant to the moment, as well as helping those companies that are have the ability to pivot, to accelerate that pivot and shift their production to current needs. And the Economic Development Corporation will administer it. I encourage anyone who is following this conversation and wants to know more about it can reach out to Sarah Miller at the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate all the work that all of my colleagues are doing to provide as much support as we can to all of our county residents, but especially those staff who are on the front lines. I just want to acknowledge that I've learned more about masks and PPE over the last month than I ever thought I would. And just also acknowledge that for our constituents at home, there has been a supply issue across the entire world. The N95 masks, the visor masks, And even the cloth reusable masks, until fairly recently, particularly the cloth reusable masks, there were just not as many manufacturers in this space. And so there has been frustration, particularly by community-based organizations on the front lines that have not had sufficient access to these critically important supplies. And I really appreciate the effort of Dr. Stoddard and the county doing the best that they can in cooperation with the state. But because the federal government has not stepped forward to ensure that these supplies are being provided to local jurisdictions, and beyond just our frontline medical personnel, that also includes our homeless shelters, that includes our facilities that are serving the most vulnerable and cannot socially distance by virtue of their work, including all of the incredible people helping in our food security space. So this is an effort by the council to seed funding, acknowledging that it's not just a funding issue, it's a supply issue, and we are doing everything we can to help increase that. And as more companies enter into this space, we will be in a better position. But I just wanted to make sure we acknowledge that it's been a supply issue, not as much a resource issue, but these resources we know will help as the supplies become more available.
Thank you very much. No other speakers? So this is introduced, 1.5A, and now we're at 1.5B, which is the special appropriation for the $500,000 for the purchase of face coverings and other personal protective equipment. Did Councilmember Reamer want to speak to that?
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up on Councilmember Alvarez's point, the vision here is that the county will procure masks with its procurement capability. The county can purchase at a larger bulk and then ensure that we're able to do at least some distribution to communities where there's greater need. For example, affordable housing providers to their residents, or police officers, if they're out and they see people walking around, they could pass them out. Bus drivers could hand them out as people board if that's needed. So we have a variety of ways that we will work with the county to distribute them. It's certainly not enough to provide a mask to everyone who needs one, but it's for those who might have more difficulty in acquiring a mask. I also want to say I think it's peace of mind for a lot of us. It's so reassuring when you see another person in a mask, because it shows that they're taking care of you and they're taking care of people around them. It's a real symbol of community support for response. And so we just want to do everything we can to support that and facilitate that. And at the amount appropriated, we should be able to pass out quite a few, but we'll assess the need on an ongoing basis. We're trying to be mindful of the county's fiscal situation at this point. And we can assess as we go the need to continue to acquire more masks for this purpose. Of course, people can make their own by cutting up a t-shirt. You don't need to have a sewing machine. You don't even have to use rubber bands. There are versions that all you need is a t-shirt and scissors. Just that's something for everyone to keep in mind. But at the same time, this is intended to support the community adoption of masks and help socialize this and get them where they're most badly needed and perhaps hardest to get. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Glaze.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank Council Members Reamer and Alvarez for their continued work on this issue. I think Councilmember Alvarez spoke for all of us when he said that we have all learned a lot about masks, the production of masks, the usefulness of masks, the medical aspects of all the different cloths and technology that's used to go into all of them. So thank you for your work on that. With regard to this particular supplemental, I just want to say that I think it's important that we leverage all of our partnerships to make sure that we get masks into the hands of everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And this includes working with the nonprofits, working with our police, and quite frankly, even working with our Department of Transportation, now that all users of the transportation systems in the state of Maryland are going to be required to wear masks. And if you don't have a mask, grab one when you get on the bus. And it's important to note that in the city of Detroit, they actually have masks available for bus patrons. So something for us to consider as we start procuring more of these masks for public dissemination. And the ordinance, the healthcare directive that we have in the county says that not wearing a mask comes with a $500 fine on the first offense, $750 for every subsequent offense. We need to keep track if those are applied. But before COVID-19, the council worked in a number of ways to improve police community relations. And I think getting these masks into the hands of MCPD to be able to give out into communities, particularly the communities and zip codes where we know that COVID-19 is higher here in Montgomery County than in many parts of the state. Probably, I think it's 3 zip codes where we have really high cases here. Let's work with our police and other frontline personnel in the county to get these masks that we're going to procure into the hands of people that we really need them. And again, thank you for all the collaboration and leadership amongst this entire council to make our community safe and healthy.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, President Katz. And I also want to thank my colleagues for putting this forward and that we're all supporting it as a council. It's really important. As Councilmember Glass was alluding to, the governor's order yesterday expanding on Montgomery County's work as a leader in the state to require facial coverings. Again, facial coverings, not masks. I think we can't say that enough, that you don't need to freak out if you don't have a medical mask. That's not what this is requiring. And I think this is another step to help with anxiety and we're going to be able to do some distribution. Someone sent me a message yesterday saying, I hope what happened in Philadelphia doesn't happen here, and where you literally had someone being dragged off a bus by law enforcement because they didn't have a face covering, and that will not happen here. I think the model that Detroit has laid out is actually giving masks out or face coverings out in our police, and some of the things that Councilmember Reamer and others have mentioned. Those are all things we're very aware of. So we want to keep everyone safe, and this is a step, I think, in the right direction to make sure that we're doing that, but also make sure that we're being equitable while we do it. So I just want to commend my colleagues, and I'm glad we're taking this step as a team. And it's also great that we're going to be helping local manufacturers who have already stepped up. So this is a win-win, and really looking forward to it. I think the face covering industry is going to be an emerging industry that is going to be with us for a very long time. And I think we've learned from this pandemic that this is probably not the last time we're going to have to deal with something. So I really appreciate the effort, and I think we're ahead of the curve on this. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the things that I kept hearing at the onset of this pandemic was that this was the great equalizer. And what we know is that is far from the truth. We have seen already how this disproportionately affects low-income people, how this really is affecting blue-collar workers. We see it here in our county with the zip code information that we received. And so I applaud the fact that we're all, I think, engaged in ensuring that whatever we do keeps that front and center. And so this effort is one of those efforts, and I really look forward to see how this is going to work out. But I agree with all the comments that we need to be strategic and make sure that we are targeting those areas where people have the most need. And it is haunting to think that there are a lot of people who just, they can't even afford, or even when we say face covering, I mean, there's a lot of confusion. So I hope that this goes a long way, and really appreciate all the work that has taken place. I'm not sure if I heard Councilman Reamer at the onset that, was it this special appropriation that was going to be modified to 100,000? Is that right?
Council President, should I reply? Or
Well, yeah, please. If it's all right with Councilmember Navarro, please.
Yeah.
This one would come down to, I think, it's $250,000. The MCEDC grant is $100,000.
Got it. Okay, so this amount is going to be modified.
Correct.
Okay.
And we'll modify it this week, and then when it appears before the council next week for the public hearing and action, it will be the corrected amount.
Got it. Got it. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate working collaboratively on all of these COVID-19 issues.
And I agree with that as well. Thank you very much. And with that, it is introduced, and we are going to go to the item on the discussion on the FY21 operating budget highlights and approach. And someone from who is ever going to lead that, please lead that.
Great. Good morning. It's hard to believe that it was exactly 1 month ago today that the county executive transmitted the operating budget on March 16th. That 1 month seems to be a very long time, and a lot has happened. And in particular, we have a number of new expenditures that we had not anticipated as early as a month ago, and a really changing revenue situation. So normally at this time, we come to you with an overview that gives you a perspective on what's in the budget that the county executive submitted. And we will be doing that briefly to give you some of the highlights of the budget. But more critically today, we'll be talking to you about some of the changes that we think are necessary and that we think will be coming. In particular, our view on how the revenue situation could be changing dramatically this year, next year, and perhaps beyond that. However, the council has to adopt the budget on May 21st. So we will also have a strategy for you on how we do that. Now, we know the council's review of the budget is always like putting together a complex puzzle with many pieces. You're always trying to figure out your priorities on expenditures, how you make increases and decreases, how you balance fiscal policy. This year is a little bit different in that we're missing some of the key pieces of the puzzle. There is so much we don't know yet, and you're going to have to adopt the budget without all the critical information you need. So the suggestion we're going to be making to you is a two-step approach of adopting the budget in May and on your normal schedule in a same services fashion, knowing full well that you will have to come back to it just a short time afterwards. So what's going to happen is that the budget, like the COVID-19 virus, will not be done in May and will continue through the summer. I also wanted, before I turn this over to Craig, who's going to go through some of the details here, I wanted to let you know that we are working carefully right now with executive staff to make sure that as soon as the $183 million in federal aid becomes available, we are able to spend it immediately and have a process so that we can both do it quickly, but provide the council with opportunities to weigh in on some of the critical decisions. And sometimes those things are at odds with each other. So we're trying to figure out a process that gives you the input you need, but doesn't tie up the spending of those funds. And we'll be back to you with a process on that. Craig's going to take you through some of the details on the budget now, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit more about our process going forward.
Here's what I found.
If I could please interrupt, Craig, before you speak, could I ask Councilmember Navarro, the Chair of Government Operations, to speak as well, please?
Thank you, Mr. President. And I definitely want to thank Ms. Michelson and Mr. Howard. It was March 24th when this council adopted the resolution that I introduced in my capacity as chair of the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee, requesting from staff to come up with scenarios that would take into consideration FY20 budget levels, taking into consideration MOE, of course, for our school system as well as our college, and really paying attention to the fact that we probably would have to come back after we adopt the budget. And this is definitely a new situation as we are all trying to navigate our way through this pandemic. But I thought it was very important that we set forth in a proactive fashion some kind of a guideline or blueprint for how we would address this particular budget. It has already been discussed in different other meetings that this might even be a optimistic approach because we really don't know what the impact will be on our resources. But I want to emphasize, as many of my colleagues have done already, that the fact that we will be coming back means that we will pay very close attention to how we proceed with supporting our staff, our brave staff on the front lines, our first responders, our law enforcement, who are working so hard right now in the middle of this pandemic in selfless ways. But at the end of the day, we understand that this is a very difficult time. I will also say that as the resolution called for that we all adopted, whatever additional spending should be related to COVID-19. We know that we can't do everything, but I think as it was illustrated by the just introduced special appropriations, we're trying to be as strategic as we can to support our entire ecosystem at this moment in time while being fiscally responsible. Lastly, I will say once again, especially because this is directed, of course, to our constituents, that previous councils have worked really hard to ensure that we could strengthen our reserves levels. And lo and behold, we did it knowing that one day we may have to face another emergency, just like we did through the recession. This is obviously different in scope. And we are very, I think, fortunate that we have stayed true to that promise. But these will be difficult times. And I very much appreciate Ms. Michelson, Mr. Howard, Mr. Smith, everybody who's working really hard in collaboration with the administration, with OMB as well as finance, so that we can all hold hands through this very difficult and very unique budget process. So thank you, everybody. We're going to get through this. We did it through the recession, and I know and I am really, really confident that we will be able to get through all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Howard, we're going to ask you to please speak.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And what I'm going to do is run through a presentation that covers the information that was in the staff report. So I'm going to share my screen, and we will, hopefully this will work correctly. And I will run through a PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. I'm assuming that you can see that, Mr. President?
I can, and I can see a few of my colleagues, but not all of my colleagues. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So we're going to walk through the FY21 operating budget overview and approach. We're going to cover a few key areas. One, as Marlene mentioned, we're going to give a summary of the executive's recommended budget, and it'll be less detailed than we typically would give during this overview presentation. We'll go through some of the budget and fiscal changes that have occurred since the executive's budget submission due to the health crisis. We'll talk about updated FY20 and FY21 revenue projection scenarios, provide some initial data and estimates from council staff's FY21 same services budget analysis, and then Marlene will finish with discussing the council options for the FY21 operating budget approval process. Because of the unique nature of this presentation, we'll ask that you hold questions until the end, and we also have on the call or the meeting representatives from the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Finance who can answer any questions you might have from them when we are done. So with that, we'll begin by a high-level overview of the executive's recommended FY21 budget. The total budget is an increase of $164.3 million, or 2.9% from the FY20 approved budget. And the tax-supported budget is an increase of $101.1 million, or 2.0% from FY20. As you can see on the far right column in the tax-supported column, the increase for Montgomery County Public Schools of $89.4 million makes up the majority of the increase over FY20. The executive's budget did fund MCPS at $39.1 million over the required maintenance of effort level. Montgomery County government had an increase of 0.8%. Montgomery College 1.3%, and that was funded at the MOE level. Park and Planning had an increase of 1.1%. However, that increase was about 5% below their request. And then there was also a small decrease, in debt service, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Then the other issue we always present overview information on is changes in workforce. The FY21 recommended budget includes 33,749 tax-supported FTEs, full-time equivalent positions. This is an increase of 775 or 2.4% from FY20. The majority of this is in MCPS. However, there was an increase of 147 FTEs in county government and 20 in park and planning. The next area we wanted to highlight is tax revenues, and there are two kind of significant departures or changes in the executive's budget from prior years that we wanted to highlight for the council. The first is that the executive recommends an increase in the income tax offset credit, or ITOC, from $692 to $800 for eligible properties. This would add $1.66 million to the estimated property tax revenue for FY21, and the ITOC has been set at $692, the previous level, since FY11. The second change is that the executive added a 3.18 cent property tax increase for Montgomery County Public Schools. This would add $65.52 million in the estimated property tax revenues for FY21, and this amount would exceed the inflation rate threshold established in Section 305 of the county charter, or what we typically refer to as the charter limit. So combined, these two recommendations would produce an increase of 4.78 cents to the weighted property tax rate compared to FY20's rate. The next section we wanted to go over is fiscal policy and components in the executive's budget. First, with reserves, the executive does recommend including resources to maintain 10.0% reserves throughout all the fiscal years in the budget, or in the fiscal plan, 6-year fiscal plan. However, factors impacting reserves, and particularly what the FY20 year-end reserve will be, have changed significantly due to the COVID-19 health crisis, and we'll be talking more about some of those shortly. In terms of debt service, as I mentioned before, there is a minimal decrease from FY20 by assuming there's $15 million in savings from refunding bonds. These savings are not typically included in the recommended budget, as it's not always known how much savings you will achieve during the year because of interest rates and things of that nature. So the council will need to consider this assumption during its review of whether to assume the savings as part of the FY21 budget. The next fiscal policy area is OPEB, or other post-employment benefits, colloquially known as retiree health benefits, pre-funding. The executive's recommended budget does meet the actuarially determined contribution for OPEB pre-funding as required by the county's current OPEB pre-funding policy. However, we did want to point out there's a significant decrease for county government pre-funding in FY21 of $22.4 million based on an updated actuarial valuation done for the plan. The executive also recommends an FY20 savings plan of $21.1 million for county government based on the same valuation. And we'll have more detail and discussion of this next week when we have our discussion of compensation and benefits. The last fiscal policy area is PAYGO. The FY21 PAYGO included in the budget is $32 million, which is in line with policy requirements. We do want to point out that PAYGO amounts may need to be reviewed as part of final CIP decisions, and we will be talking about that in the next item on the CIP path forward and approach after we're finished talking about the operating budget.
Okay.
No. Hold on. Okay, there we go. I was stuck for a second. The next area is the collective bargaining agreements and pay adjustments that we typically provide a high-level overview of. Again, I want to point out that we'll have a lot more detail on these issues in our April 23rd discussion on compensation and benefits. So the executive did negotiate new 3-year agreements with McGeo and the FOP and a new 2-year agreement with IAFF. The table here shows the recommended pay and benefit adjustments in those agreements, as well as what the executive is recommending for non-represented employees. There's general wage adjustments for each bargaining unit plus the non-reps, ranging from 1.0% for FOP, 1.25% for McGeo and non-represented employees, and 2.25% for IAFF employees. and you'll note there are different effective dates for each of those general wage adjustments. There's a service increment of 3.5% included for all the employee groups listed, and that applies to employees who are not at top of grade. The McGeo agreement includes a 1.25% past year service increment from FY11. The FOP agreement includes a salary schedule adjustment of 3.5%, and this would apply to employees who are not at top of grade and would essentially provide a second service increment to those employees. And additionally, the McGeo executive negotiated with McGeo, and this is also included for non-represented employees, the retirement contribution shift of 1.0%. And what this would do would be to increase the county's contribution rate for everyone in the retirement plans by 1.0% and decrease the employee's contribution rate by the same amount, 1.0%. So as a result, it would provide an effective pay increase for these employees of an additional 1.0%. And for, I should note, for under the non-represented row, everything in here applies to MLS management employees as well, except for the service increment, because those employees receive a pay for performance instead of an annual service increment. Then this next table shows the cost of the pay and compensation adjustments included in the executive's budget. The total cost in FY21 is $28 million, or $22.4 million if you're looking at just the tax-supported portion. Because, as in past years, because some of these pay adjustments occur not at the beginning of the year, but partway through the year, the annualized cost of the agreements, or the full year cost, is higher. So the annualized cost is $38.2 million or $30.4 million if you're looking at tax supported. And the difference between the FY21 and the annualized cost would actually occur in FY22. So these costs would become part of the FY22 base budget. The last section we wanted to highlight in the executive's budget is that there's a productivity improvements non-departmental account, or NDA, that's included. This is actually funded at a negative $10 million. And the purpose of this NDA, as described in the budget, is it's intended to identify cost efficiencies and reductions throughout the year that would total $10 million, and is part of a collaborative effort between county leadership, management, and represented employees. So essentially, this assumes that there would be an additional $10 million in reductions in the budget. However, these dollars are not allocated to individual or specific departments or programs. The county attorney has previously concluded that the council is not allowed to approve a negative appropriation as part of the operating budget, and we included a memorandum from the county attorney on that issue in the staff report. And so council staff's view is that the council could not approve the executive's budget as recommended without finding an additional $10 million in resources or reducing expenditures by $10 million within specific departments or programs or agencies. So that's the highlights of what was included in the executive's budget. But of course, as was mentioned, a lot has changed since March 16th. So we wanted to highlight a few budget and fiscal items that have changed since the executive's budget submission. First, there's been several additional FY20 appropriations. Currently, the council has approved $38.5 million. Of course, nearly all of this for COVID-19 emergency funding, and there was more potential appropriations introduced this morning. The important point here is this could impact the FY20 year-end reserves, and so what the executive was planning on in his budget submission may not be what ends up occurring because some of the additional appropriations we have had to make. The second issue or pay and budget issue is the COVID-19 pay differential. So the executive did come to agreements with the employee unions on additional pay for front-facing on-site and back-office on-site employees whose functions cannot be performed remotely. So they must still come in and perform their work functions either at the office or in the field. This agreement is with McGeo, IAFF, and the FOP. And the executive also applied these changes to non-represented employees on the general services schedule, so non-management employees. And this pay differential would be in effect for 6 pay periods or the entire length of the Maryland state of emergency, depending on what goes longer. Also, as Marlene mentioned, there's the federal and state reimbursement. We do anticipate receiving the $183.2 million from the CARES Act. The funding is restricted to COVID-19 related activities, and we'll work through the expenditures with that as soon as we receive it. So the next piece is updated revenue projections. And council staff and executive staff work together to develop 3 different scenarios to estimate the impact on the county's tax revenue due to the health crisis. These are rough estimates currently based on economic conditions with limited real-time and historical data. Unlike the state, the county does not have real-time data on actual income taxes and other tax collections. Also, the property tax, which is a large percentage of our resources, is mostly collected in the fall of each year. And so given the unique nature of the current situation, we do want to stress that these are estimated ranges and are subject to change as more data is received and reviewed. And also wanted to point out that none of the scenarios include reductions in expenditures or additional aid to replace lost revenues. So we considered 3 scenarios, and we based these on the FY20 estimated revenue values from the March recommended budget. The first scenario is a short recession due to the health crisis and a quick recovery by the end of FY21. Given the recent data from the state and other governments, we do stress that this is probably the least likely scenario, but we did want to include it for explore it and include it for comprehensive reasons. Scenario 2 is a short recession due to the health crisis, but a longer recovery until about FY24. And scenario 3 is a deep recession due to the health crisis with a long recovery until about FY25 or FY26. So what we did is we did FY20 estimates, FY21 estimates, and then a combined FY20 and 21 in the far right column, which you'll see. And that's because the exact timing of when impacts will occur could fluctuate between the different fiscal years. So for the short recession, quick recovery scenario, the total combined FY21 and 20 and 21 reductions in tax revenue is $150 to $250 million in reductions. And again, we think this is probably the least likely scenario given current information. For the second scenario, short recession, long recovery, we are looking at potential reductions of $260 million to $500 million in revenue. And in the third scenario, the deep recession, long recovery, we are looking at potential revenue reductions ranging from $360 million to $600 million. And again, these estimates are falling in line with some of the estimates that we've seen from other local jurisdictions recently. A couple things we wanted to highlight about the revenue projections and kind of what's included and what's not included. We know that several factors will still impact these projections, and some are known and some are not known. Things that we did include were estimates for reductions in wage and salary income, reductions in capital gains income, reductions in property taxes due to appealed assessments and a decrease in new construction, and also assumed reductions in property sales. Things that are still unknown and are not included in the estimates and could impact them in either direction. First, the impact of CARES Act benefits on unemployed or furloughed workers. Second, the recovery period, how long it will take when social distancing measures are lifted. The third is future stock market corrections and fluctuations in 2020. And the last is repositioning by businesses and industries after the health crisis. Examples include what will happen with accommodations in hospitality industries, what will happen with travel industries and things like that, and how long they will last. There's a lot of repositioning that could occur that could affect things differently than has occurred in different recessions. So given all that information, what the executive recommended and the changes since the executive's recommended budget came out, we'll now go through the council's FY21 operating budget and approach and talk about some different scenarios and options. First, in terms of the framework for the council's review and action on the budget, we'll start with, we of course have our council budget deadlines. By May 1st, the council needs to express its intent to approve or reject the collective bargaining agreements, although it could extend the deadline to May 15th if needed. And by June 1st, the council must approve a balanced budget. And as Marlene mentioned, we are currently on schedule for action on May 21st. So within this framework, as Councilmember Navarro mentioned, the council adopted Resolution 19-388, which asks council staff to develop viable options for budget approval, including a same services budget option. This would include funding MCPS and the college at the required maintenance of effort levels, and also include flexibility for future appropriations related to assisting county residents and businesses, additional resources for programs and services, and employee wage and benefit enhancements if possible after the crisis is over. So based on those guidelines, we did begin our same services analysis for the FY21 operating budget for all the different agencies. And so for Montgomery County government, we started with this chart to kind of show you what we included and did not include in our initial same services analysis. For what we included as same services was the annualization of FY20 compensation costs and positions, so things that were already in the budget in FY20. Adjustments to operational costs, such as mail, motor pool, things like that. Shifts and realignments, technical adjustments. We included any reductions that were recommended by the executive. And we also included increases due to legal or policy requirements to fund the same and or required services. So a great example is additional school health nursing staff for new schools that are opening. The changes that we did not include as same services based on the guidelines were FY21 compensation and benefit adjustments, enhancements unless they are required by law or policy, additions for new costs, staff, or programs, and also we did not include restoration of items that were not as part of the FY20 budget. So for MCPS and Montgomery College, this analysis funds them at the MOE level. And then for park and planning, it's a similar process for county government. Some of the languaging and descriptions of the budget changes they use are a little bit different, but it kind of follows the same chart as I just went through for county government. So the result of our initial analysis shows a few things. First, based on the council's guidelines, approximately $70 million could be reduced from agency uses under this same services approach. And this amount is slightly greater than the $65.5 million levied from the proposed supplementary property tax increase in the executive's recommended budget. So if the council chose not to approve the tax increase exceeding the charter limit, there may be sufficient resources from the same services approach to cover that loss of revenue. We'll still require more council input to finalize the adjustments for each agency and department. Of course, we'll be working with executive staff as well. And also, we want to point out that the initial analysis did not explore in great deal adjustments to non-agency uses, such as debt service, PAYGO, CAP current revenue, reserves, and OPEB, things like that. So those will also need to be incorporated into the further approaches. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marlene to discuss options for moving forward.
Okay, so our recommended option for you, and we'll have an alternative too, but our recommended option is that you proceed as suggested in the resolution, adopting a same services budget, but that would include some critical adjustments and also a review of our fiscal policies and what you want to do about that. And as part of this, the council would ask the executive to submit budget revisions early in the fiscal year as soon as it has additional information about what further expenditures are necessary, what we may see in terms of reductions to revenues, and also whether there might be additional federal money beyond the $183 million that we already know about. So that we're hoping that even in a few short months, we'll be in a much better place to make decisions. And finally, even though you may adopt a same services budget, our recommendation will be that you direct all departments and agencies to do everything that they can to minimize expenditures going forward. to freeze any non-critical vacancies and to look for ways to reduce the operating costs going forward. And Craig, if you could move on to the next slide. So to adopt the same services budget, we're first going to be working with executive staff to make sure we have a clear understanding of what is in their budget, and we will refine our numbers. But then our intent would be to take each department's same services to the council so that you can consider critical adjustments. And some of those, for example, might be reductions. And the best example I can think of is if we've already canceled a program that was supposed to be operational this summer, and we already know we won't have those expenditures, that should be pulled out of the budget. This will not be a detailed analysis of reductions. That will happen in the summer. But we think if there's any obvious ones, let's take them now while we have the chance. At the same time, the council may want to make some critical additions to the budget. Some of those may be, or most of them we would assume would be COVID-19 related, but there may be other sort of very critical adjustments that you think would be necessary. As we do this, we're going to be very carefully tracking any increase in expenditures for COVID-19. That's going to be very critical in terms of getting reimbursement from the federal government on the CARES Act money. And then finally, we're going to need to look back at all of our fiscal policies and determine whether the council wants to, at this moment in time for May, try and meet those fiscal policies or how you might want to adjust them. And a good example is, I think we will be doing all we can to stay with the 10% reserve target. When we come back in May, that may not be possible, but for now that would be ideal, particularly if we can already use some of the federal government funding to reimburse the supplementals that you have been passing. On the other hand, the council may very well want to consider a one-time reduction in a PAYGO contribution to free up money for the operating budget. So we will be taking you back through all of these different fiscal policies to see where you believe those should come out. The other alternative is that the council, if the council believes that the need for reductions are so critical that we should start doing them right now, we can do a quick analysis of potential reductions. And the primary reason why we're not recommending this is it is very hard right now to identify the magnitude of the gap and what those reductions should be. And may be very difficult for you and for the public to do a first round of reductions now, and then come back 2 months later and have to cut again. And we think there might be some benefit to doing it at once in the summer. But nonetheless, if you decide that this is your preferred approach, we think there should be guidelines. And some of the ones that we can think of immediately are to do everything possible that would to avoid reductions in workforce. If in the worst case scenario we showed you in terms of revenues, that may not be possible going forward, but we do think that that should be a priority for the council. To minimize reductions for any services that assist residents and businesses impacted by COVID-19. We want to do everything we can to not only assist them, but to help strengthen the economy going forward. And our third criteria for any reductions would be to do everything we can to maintain the county's financial stability and bond rating. And so that would be an alternative, but you can hear from our recommendations consistent with your resolution. We think the better approach is same services now and returning to the budget very early in the fiscal year. And with that, we'll stop, and Craig and I are available to answer questions.
Well, first off, thank you all very, very much. You always do a wonderful job, and especially at budget time, you're obviously, it's always very obvious the great work that you do. I do think that we need to be having the discussions, and I know several of my colleagues are going to be speaking, but I do think we need to be having the discussions about critical adjustments, because we need to understand that we're not going to have the revenues, and we're going to have different expenditures and greater expenditures in many, many areas. And to your point about that, we're going to get some monies back from the federal government, and that's going to be helpful. And it would be certainly wonderful if they could help us beyond what we already believe they're going to help us with. But I'm somebody that always has understood that until you have money in your hand, you shouldn't count it. So we have to be very careful on that. I do think we have to be flexible in our thoughts. COVID-19 is the immediate, and we certainly are working together with the county executive side and obviously the entire county council, working together to try to figure out a pathway so that we can be helping the people that need to be helped. And it's more and more people each and every day. But I also believe we need to be looking at beyond COVID-19. And maybe it's a continuation of COVID-19 once the immediate crisis is not as obvious. But we're going to have all of those situations, and we need to figure out what's the next best way we can do it. Marlene, you suggested about the concern about reductions now and whether we should be taking the time, and I agree with that. I believe it's such a fast-moving process that the reductions, to look at reductions right now is tomorrow it could change, and I understand that. But I do think maybe we should look at a hybrid and to at least give us some idea what we should be looking at if we are looking at reductions for the immediate, just to know what kind of scenario we're dealing with. So I appreciated that as well. And with that, I'm going to ask Councilmember Rice to please give his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you both, Marlene and Craig, for all of your great work. I think that you've summed up exactly some great points about what we need to consider. I will say that at the beginning, and I appreciate Councilmember Navarro, I want to look to my right, I guess, my left personally, but because that's where Nancy is on my screen. But do want to thank her for really starting us off with that idea from the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee in terms of putting forth that resolution to talk about a same services budget. When this first broke, my first call was to Dr. Smith to talk specifically about what was going to happen with our school system, understanding that this would have tremendous impacts, but also understanding that things would not be the same for a very long time. And since then, the school system has been operating under that premise. And they, as well as Montgomery College, have been great partners with us all the time and continue to be in this light. And my conversations with Dr. Pollard are exactly the same. They continue to do whatever they can, and they're already enacting cost containment measures because they know that this is going to be an incredibly trying time. So when I had a very frank conversation with the superintendent, it was one that encompassed us talking about a maintenance of effort budget. He's not advocating for that, of course, as superintendent of schools, nor should I expect that, but he certainly understands that that's where this council is, that's where this county is, that's where this state and this nation is right now. And so from that perspective, I think that's the responsible thing for us to do. Everyone is expecting for us to try and keep business going as much as it can be close to usual from that standpoint, understanding that, we have opportunity gaps and all kinds of stuff that continue to exist, but we should focus on them around what we're seeing with our new normal right now, which is COVID-19, coronavirus prevention measures, and also around what we need to do with online and distance learning. Something in which is going to be incredibly challenging as our school system about to move into the fourth quarter. We'll be discussing some of that tomorrow in a conference call that we have with our folks from our education space. But this is one in which I think that overall we have some great actors who really understand what needs to happen and who are in it with us. And so when we talk about we're all in this together, I know that our school systems and the leaders from the school boards to the board of trustees from Montgomery College are all on board. They understand where we are. And our federal government and state government, to your point, has said that they're going to try and get additional money to help offset, understanding that there are tremendous pushes and pulls on our education system as a whole. So as one council member, as chair of the Education and Culture Committee, I can tell you that I feel comfortable and confident that our education partners certainly understand a same services budget is fair. It is something that makes sense for us in terms of really trying to set us up for the future in terms of recovering from this, and gives us the best ability to really keep those things stable and avoid a future need for a layoff or for other kinds of things. If we start to reduce and level the expectations now in terms of from a fiscal perspective, it actually carries forward for us much better than doing any kind of increases that then mean we may have to have significant reductions later on. So again, just want to say thank you very much. As you can hear, that pretty much aligns with your first recommendation. So that's where I am, Mr. President, and certainly where our school systems, both Montgomery College and Montgomery County Public Schools, are as well.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Morning, everybody. And thank you, Marlene and Craig, for this great analysis. These are, very challenging times, and I appreciate how much you pulled together so quickly. And I'm grateful to Councilwoman Navarro for the recommendation. I think that makes, I think the same service budget makes a lot of sense under these circumstances. It will be hard to get there. It'll be hard to identify the savings. But I think it's certainly the right place for us to start. I do think that that we should really push not just the executive branch, but the executive to partner with us to help find the savings. Every year I think that I've been here, even during a good economy, what was perceived as a strong economy, but always has externalities and one-off things like the wind case and other things that we had to rise to the occasion and find revenue for. We've had a savings plan coming from the executive, and we haven't in this case. And we weren't wild about the budget that was sent over, even being fair and knowing it was put together, built on assumptions that are no longer the case. So, I bet we largely agree on this, but having our staff work with executive branch staff is one thing. Asking the executive to work with us to find savings in this unprecedented time, and to direct his staff to find savings and give them a target to find savings, I think is the right thing to ask for as well, because OMB and their staff have all the information. They have a lot more experts in budget analysis than we have in each of those departments. And they have the time on their hands now. I don't know about all of you and our staff, but I'm working 18 hours a day and overwhelmed with constituent requests. I think the more we make it easy on ourselves and ask the executive to identify the savings to meet the goals that we're setting out today, the better, because he really has the leverage with those department heads to find the savings and the insight into the detail that we don't have. Contracts that don't need to go forward shouldn't go forward. Pins that we may have funded in FY20 that don't need to be added right now ought to be put on pause. They have a lot more access to detail than we do and more leverage. And I hope the executive will partner with us to reach this goal, because we all know we have not just less revenue coming in, potentially historically less revenue, but many more expenditures as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
There we go. Thank you. Next is Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. Let's see. There's so much to say. First of all, I want to follow up on Tom's points because I agree. I think it's very unusual that the county executive has not recommended an amendment to his budget proposal. I joined the county council in 2010, and it was in the midst of the free fall in the recession. And the county executive at that time was sending periodic budget amendments as the revenue numbers kept deteriorating. And the relevance here is it's the responsibility of leadership of the county executive to sit the parties down and try to work out at least the first attempt at matching the expenses with the revenues. And all we've gotten from this county executive so far is he's continuing to advocate for his property tax increase in the midst of this recession. And he's leaving it to us so far to have to make the tough decisions. I don't think that's the way this is supposed to work. It's got to be, I mean, the way it's supposed to work is he's supposed to recommend amendments to the budget, and then we consider them and we enact a final budget. So I am frustrated by that. If the county executive's position is he just wants to stick to the property tax increase and fund the budget at the proposed level, I think that's fine, but he's not really being clear about what he wants. He is making assertions that are mixed messages, I think. But it's highly relevant here because the hard part is sitting down with the players and identifying how to make use of more limited resources. So I am concerned about how this process is working. I do think, same services is clearly going to be a high water mark, unfortunately. I think we need to make some decisions very soon about what we're going to do. One question I have is for council staff, I don't understand this $10 million magic asterisk funding item. And I refer to it as the magic asterisk because some of you know the story of David Stockman and OMB when he ran it under Reagan and how they set the federal budget on a path to exploding deficits by making up numbers about how they were going to reconcile expenditures and revenue. And the fictional part of it was described in an asterisk. And the great columnist Bill Grider wrote a story about it called The Education of David Stockman. And I actually had a chance to sit next to Bill Grider in a suite for a couple of years. And he told me the story of it. But the magic asterisk is sort of a legend of the Reagan budget. They made up the idea that the numbers were going to work. This $10 million item that balances the budget somehow, I mean, it's necessary for the budget to be in balance, is that there's going to be some future savings met. Have you received any details about what that actually would be?
Well, what we've heard is that it's anticipated efficiencies that may be identified. But unlike the federal government, we need to approve a balanced budget. The council doesn't have any choice in that regard. And the county attorney has already given us an opinion previously saying when the council one year wanted to have a similar type of savings, that it could not be done, that you need to specifically identify the savings. So from our perspective, it means that there's a $10 million hole that the council needs to now fill, either through additional reductions or additional resources. And given the signal that the council has already sent us about not wanting to try and increase taxes, it really is going to be additional reductions that need to be identified.
So this budget has a property tax increase. We have not received any official word that that's changed. And there's an additional $10 million fictional savings item about which we have no information of what initiative might produce that savings. There was no thorough plan presented to the council, to the staff, about how that $10 million is going to be realized?
No, we don't have any additional detail on that, other than the $10 million and the general comments that are in the budget about potential efficiencies.
I mean, normally, I think for a $10 million item, you would expect some specifics as to how you would, I mean, I would be willing to take that seriously if there was some very specific information as to how that money was going to be saved, although it sounds like it's illegal in the first place for the budget to be recommended this way, or I should say against the charter. But nevertheless, so no information was provided. it's disappointing. This doesn't seem consistent with the tradition of budgeting in this county. All right, thanks.
Okay, are you finished? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Ms. Michelson and Mr. Howard, for that presentation. This feels like horrible deja vu, because obviously many of us were there and experienced the brunt of the recession from 10 years ago. We've talked about it many times before. And I do remember at the time vividly the strong partnership between the council and the executive branch to get us through an unprecedented, at the time, difficult time. I remember working closely with Vivian Yao, who was the staff representative from the council who worked with the rec department at the time. I remember that Mike Knapp, as chair of the Fed committee, was consistently, and his team, working collaboratively with the executive branch and OMB and finance, because we knew that collectively we just didn't have a lot of time, that you only have a few months to produce this massive document and go through reams of information line item by line item. And so it is going to be critically important, as has been stated articulately, for us to work collaboratively to identify savings and to see what we can do to move this forward. We also need to give serious consideration to high-level priorities and have that drive how these very difficult budget decisions will be made. Obviously, economic development and getting us through this recession and taking steps to help shore up and support our business community, to making sure that as a baseline, we state, as was stated 10 years ago, that we would do everything possible to hold the line on not reducing county staff. And I really want to commend Councilmember Navarro, who rung the bell early in this process, acknowledging all of that, and by setting the expectation, and obviously there are going to have to be adjustments made, most likely down, but setting the expectation that through a same service budget, it puts us in a better position to articulate to all of our key stakeholders and friends in our labor, and friends in the nonprofit sector, and friends in our business community and our constituents, acknowledging that we're going to have to make some extraordinarily difficult decisions. And we're going to have to do it in tandem with the executive branch, and there will be disagreement on various line items. But what we have to make sure happens is that we work as tightly as we can, because we don't have a lot of time, and the world has so significantly changed. It's almost impossible to process everything. And we're still in the midst of this crisis. We don't know when the governor is going to release the emergency declaration. We have no idea. And we do know that as he begins to release it, it's going to be slow and over time. And I don't have a high degree of confidence that the testing is keeping pace with our ability to alleviate that in any reasonable time frame. And so you're looking at something that's going to carry into the summer. And I do just want to make one other comment with regards to the savings. And this is more directed, obviously we're limited in what we can do in terms of tracking the savings and the budget within MCPS. But there have to be some pretty substantial savings by virtue of the dramatic change in operations that they've gone under. There have clearly been some increases in funding in some areas, but probably some significant decreases in others. And the same is true within the rec department and libraries, offset obviously in rec by the loss of revenue from being able to charge for classes and programs. But there are probably some substantial savings there. I mean, I hate to say this, but Memorial Day is around the corner, and it's highly unlikely that our pools are going to open on time. And that represents the summer months, some of the largest expenditures just within rec, and that's just one department. And so I just urge us and my colleagues in the executive branch to work with us and to acknowledge that very difficult decisions are going to have to be made, and we need to articulate that now and not do finger pointing because that will get us nowhere. And we really need to do that now and just let folks know, I hate to say this, but it's going to be hard just to even hold the line, let alone have to make some of these reductions. So I have a huge headache thinking about all of this, and it's like bringing back so many horrible memories. But here we are again, and we do know the roadmap, which will be a difficult one that we're going to have to follow.
Thank you very much. At a press conference I guess it's been a couple months ago, I was asked what keeps me up at night. This keeps you up at night, to your point. The next speaker is Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. And again, thank you, Mr. Howard and Ms. Michelson, for working so swiftly on these scenarios. Everything is fluid right now. I recognize that. But I think that this is a great starting point. And I am always reminded of the many conversations we had about the reserves throughout the years. And we always talked about how reserves were basically to try and maintain continuity of operations in case of a major emergency. And that is what came to mind, thinking back, of course, of joining this council in 2009 and realizing that everything was just coming so quickly. But this issue of continuity of operations seems so important right now as everyone is trying to do their best to confront something that is just so unprecedented and just so scary. And I felt that it would be important for departments to know that, yes, you will continue to operate for nonprofits, et cetera, understanding that we would have to adjust, understanding that MOE would be important, but that we may have to adjust. And so I'm going to say the following, and I just speak for myself. This is time for leadership. This is not time to sit back and start, pointing fingers and maybe the executive should have done this and so should have done that. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. So yes, it's unusual. Of course it's unusual. Everything is unusual right now. So this is an attempt for us who the council now owns this budget. It's an attempt for us to confront a very unusual, unprecedented situation and try to make the best at it in a way that is fair. And so for me, prioritizing continuity of operations is critical. And that's why option A, it's so important. Now, if indeed we then face, some news immediately or in a week or whatever, where we have to then realize and accept that option A is not even feasible, then of course the executive will need to send over the savings plan. It is up to the executive to do that. We should not be in a position to identify those cuts. We need to work collaboratively, and that's what the previous executive did. And as somebody mentioned just, recently, it was like an everyday thing. You would wake up and here's a savings plan, and 2 days later is another one. But that is the job. And I appreciate Councilmember Albornoz's also observations about how, yes, the fact that everything is kind of close right now, there will be some interesting savings that need to be examined. All of that needs to come together. The $10 million, in my opinion, is such a drop in the bucket. Like, seriously, okay, let's just, work with that. But at the end of the day, I believe that we as a body have been called in a specific moment in time to lead. That's what our constituents want. So, the faster that we can act in a very responsible way to ensure continuity of operations, to work quickly like we have been doing. It's been amazing, to shift very quickly. I think that's what's going to really help us get through this. It is fluid. We understand. I think the message here is, look, we'll keep having those tough conversations if we need to have them. But our constituents just see one county government, they're not looking at, is this, Mark Elrich's thing, or is this the council thing or whatever. They just want us to be there for them at a time that is so stressful and with such high level of anxiety. So I honestly just seriously want to thank you because, this gets us started, I think, in a very, it's a great starting point. And again, I think, our union leaders, I know many of you were received phone calls. I think they get it. They understand this is not, we're not trying to be coy here about our financial situation. Everybody knows where we are. And just like we did through the last recession, all of us came together with one thing in mind, which was to avoid layoffs. That's what was keeping me up at night at that moment in time, thinking about our employees who had mortgages, who had children, and we did everything possible to avoid layoffs. This is such a different situation, but that's my starting point as well. And so, again, really appreciate it. As chair of the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee, it's been interesting how to have had to kind of navigate this throughout my 11 years on the council. But to me, I think this is a great starting point. And again, thank you, staff, because I know we're all stressed. You're stressed. There's so much that you're doing that is unprecedented, and you guys have stepped up as always and done an amazing, amazing job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Council President, for your leadership. Thank you to Councilmember Navarro for her leadership and for bringing her perspective from the prior economic downturn and the lessons learned from that. I think it's really important at this time to have that leadership, and both of you for being my colleagues on the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee, where I think this puts those policies into action more than ever before. The prudent decisions that were made prior to me showing up and the four of us who joined this council showing up, some of those important decisions like the 10% reserves and the bringing down the debt to lower our debt load slowly but surely. Those decisions are now more important than ever, and the leadership that had been demonstrated previously is bearing its fruit now, though much more leadership is needed. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, and note that, as has been stated before, and Councilmember Navarro mentioned in the early going of her comments, that tough decisions were made prior to this crisis to put us in a better position than most. But we are in as challenging a position as we've ever been, and we're going to have to meet that challenge together. I think it's important to note, first of all, that I think the staff's work has been extraordinary. Last year, I saw during the budget the tremendous work of this council staff, and it is becoming more evident than ever right now as we have to make these very tough decisions and take on the mantle to figure out how we're going to get through this crisis and meet the needs of our community while having a budget that we can approve that can actually be sustained. And that's a challenge, and really do thank council staff. I think the same services budget is a prudent approach at this moment. I appreciate that recommendation. However, we all recognize that's a best case scenario. Ideally, we can continue with a same services budget, but I don't think that that is likely based on where this is headed, based on the numbers from the state, based on numbers from our neighboring jurisdictions on revenue impacts, and based on the very information that we have in this packet and from the work of our staff, and frankly, the consensus of the executive staff that seemingly agrees with these numbers, that we're going to have to make some really tough choices as county leaders. And we have to prove that we're up to the task, not just to meet this moment, but to meet the moments to follow, and to make sure that we have a budget that can sustain the long term. Governing is about choosing. Leadership is about making tough decisions. Now more than ever, in the middle of a crisis, we need executive leadership in the county. We need to be working together, county council and county executive. As was noted before, it has been staggering to me that we have yet to get revised budget requests. We've yet to get savings plans that react to this crisis. We've yet to get significant information or even broad signaling of where the executive is on these issues. It is drastically different than what the county saw in the previous major economic downturn, and I think it needs to change for us to be able to get through this. And I think it's important to recognize, we saw in the budget earlier that the proposal, while written admittedly at a different time for a different moment, but had 147 new positions. Last budget had a number of new positions. We have been told about a major reorganization of county government, working in partnership, locked arms with the partnership in labor to be able to figure that out. Up to this point, we have not seen any reorganization at all. We've seen more is more, and we have not seen more is less at all. And necessity is the mother of invention. And now we desperately need it. Before we needed it, now we desperately need it. And, all we've seen when it comes to a reorganization is, frankly, a phantom negative appropriation, which is illegal, which literally this council is not by law allowed to pass. Hoping for cuts is not a strategy. Asking for cuts to be made at a later date or efficiencies to be found at a future time is not an appropriate way to pass a budget, is not an appropriate or legal way to move forward as we have to make these tough decisions. And, so I just, it was mentioned earlier with Councilmember Reamer about the magic asterisk and the comparison to that. But, as has been noted, that was a PR campaign. The federal government doesn't have to approve a balanced budget. We do. And so we can't just rhetoric our way out of this. We need results to get our way out of this, and we need reality to be part of this. And a $10 million phantom possibility to be named at a later date is not reality. It's fantasy, and we need to get out of that. We need to be addressing this crisis with the seriousness and the leadership that it requires. I do have a couple of questions. I don't know if it's for council staff or for executive staff or both, but it's still not clear to me exactly how we're handling the FY20, current year impacts of this crisis. Are we going to get a savings plan, or do we have information from the executive branch of what that's going to look like? Is that all going to come from reserves? Are there efficiencies that are being found because, rec centers aren't open, for instance, and other impacts? Our energy bills might be down because we're not using as many buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have any guidance on that? Do we have any indication of what that's going to look like?
I think I'll turn that over to executive staff. I don't know if who wants to take that up, but I'll ask Rich Madalino to start unless there's anybody else. I know they are in the midst of doing their analysis of the third quarter expenditures for county government and assessments of the fourth quarter. But Rich, if you're there, do you want to add something?
Sure. I just I wanted to make sure I'd unmute myself. And I just want to ask the council president, do you want me to take questions at this point, or did you want to get through everyone's opening statements?
Well, I don't know that these are opening statements. These are people's statements. No, please, if Councilmember Friedson has asked a question, please give an answer as best you can.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's nice to see you all. I wish we could all be together in person for this conversation. As far as the savings plan for FY20, we're still trying to figure out our way through all of the new federal funds that are now available to us. And I'll use an example. We've spent a lot of time talking about the $183 million that the county executive applied for this week. That will provide us with the ability, for example, to backfill the supplemental appropriations that you all have added to the budget. But one of the federal fund items that was included in the Relief Act provides money to transit systems around the country, recognizing that so many transit systems like our own have stopped collecting fares, and even before that had a tremendous drop off in ridership. And of course, we're, I think, down to running only a quarter of the routes that we were before the crisis. So the transit money is very different from a rule standpoint than the overall relief money. And the guidance so far from the federal government would suggest that it would allow us to, in fact, substitute for lost revenues. And therefore, if we have that flexibility to eliminate a whole bunch of county dollars from the transit program and backfill it with federal funds, then we will move forward with a savings plan on that item for you. But we are as your staff, as you are, we are trying to figure out all of this new guidance from the federal government before sending over a comprehensive savings plan to you. So you should know on the preliminary results from the third quarter analysis, which we will hopefully be getting to you certainly by Monday, show that in fact revenues, expenditures are below the current authorized budget, except for the supplementals that you all have passed. And again, all of that should then be funded by federal funds. So we are, from an operating standpoint in FY20, we are managing things very well. We are able to buy all the personal protection equipment that we can get our hands on. I think Councilmember Albornoz was the first to make the point about there is a global deficit of PPE. So it's not like we don't have the resources to buy it. There just hasn't been the supply to buy it. So we are preparing a savings plan for you. It just is not anything that we need to bring forward right now until we know over the next few weeks what the guidance is from the federal government about all of the relief funds that they are providing to the state and local governments.
Do we have any idea of a timeline for when we would receive that savings plan that you've referred to?
Well, as you might imagine, we are wrestling with the state of Maryland over the transit dollars because that is allocated, the federal government allocated by state. Then the state has to figure out how much is going to the Baltimore region and the Washington region for MTA and WMATA, and then we have to wrestle with WMATA about how much money can come to Montgomery and Prince George's for our local bus systems. So until we have those numbers, it doesn't make sense to bring over a savings plan. So I understand your desire to have this information. I would love to have sent something over 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, but it is a tremendous amount of information that is not within our control as we wait for federal action, for state action. So it's not out of a lack of want to do it. It's out of being able to send you the correct information for you to act and for the public to understand what we're doing.
Okay, as soon as you have a timeline for when you expect that to be sent over, even if it's not ready to be sent over, if you could let us know, because we need to get something or to have an idea of when we would receive something. So I would appreciate that.
Sure. And I've been laboring under the idea of you don't want department by department savings plans. You want more comprehensive documents because I think it makes it easier to tell the story. Because if we just sent over a savings plan for a small department, I fear the response would be, oh, you're not thinking big enough. So let's have we want to make sure we have a quality document to send over for you and for the public to understand some of the changes that are occurring in FY20.
Okay, well, we need a quality document, but we need a document, and right now we've got nothing. So we'd appreciate what you can send over as soon as you can send it over. Has the executive been in any active conversations or discussions with the bargaining units about the practicality of those contracts in light of the current crisis that we're in?
Well, as Mr. Howard mentioned in his presentation, obviously we spent a fair amount of time negotiating with them about what to do with emergency pay and the pay differential that we came to an agreement with. We're in constant communication with them about the health and safety of county employees and what we are all doing to ensure that. The law provides us with no grounds to renegotiate the contracts. The law and the prior administration went to court over this and lost. We have a legal responsibility to advocate for the contracts and nothing more and nothing less.
So no is the answer.
We have no legal ability to renegotiate contracts unless and until you make a decision about those contracts.
Okay, so you're waiting for us to take action on that. Okay.
As the law specifies.
Okay, and then there were a series of introductions of bills at the request of the executive that were put forward on Tuesday. Many of them, I think all of them, were related to the budget and making sure that there was authorization in law to reflect, organizational changes in the budget. There were 4 or 5 changes. One, do those have specific budget impacts? I imagine all of them do. And 2, in light of the fact that we may be look like we are heading towards the same services budget, are any of those bills relevant any longer? Like, should we even be taking them up and considering them in light of the fact that we may not be moving forward with the proposed budget, which includes something that, $10 million of, an illegal appropriation that we couldn't pass even if we wanted to?
Yeah, I don't want to, there could be, I think in a handful of cases, as part of the bills that do the reorganization, there are small adjustments to annualize costs, but those reorganizations don't add money to the budget. You should know, and we'll be happy to go through this. One of the things that, like, when you look at the OMB budget, you'll see shifts that include new positions for OMB that were vacant positions from other departments, other smaller departments, the non-principal departments in particular, because what we're trying to do is centralize providing budget staff and procurement and personnel staff to the small offices so that they don't have to duplicate that effort. So, there are efforts within the budget to save time and money and long-term personnel costs. That is just one small example of some of the shifts that are happening in order to, in the long run, save money for the county as we rationalize some of the back office.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like council staff to analyze all of those bills and determine whether or not that's accurate. Last year, we were told in the Government Operations Committee that there was just movement and restructuring and that it didn't have a real cost. In fact, it had a savings. It turned out, when I was skeptical of that, raised some questions, council staff confirmed what our expectations were, that the savings that were anticipated weren't real. They were phantom savings. And so, I'd like council staff to analyze that before we seriously take up any of those bills, just a request. And secondly, it would be great to get the legal guidance on the contracts and whether or not we're able to get any guidance from the executive branch, or whether it would be illegal, like the $10 million negative appropriation was determined to be illegal, if it would be illegal to provide guidance to the county council of the direction that the executive wanted to go in, or if the executive is legally allowed to, reopen or, discuss the bargaining process, since the executive is the leader of collective bargaining for the county, before we formally take up the contracts.
Because you and others have asked me that question repeatedly. I have asked the county attorney's office repeatedly about this, and I've been told every time we have a legal responsibility to defend the contracts and no grounds to reopen the contracts without facing an unfair labor practice charge or prohibitive labor practice charge. So
that's fair. Well, I'd love to get something in writing. I don't want to discuss it here. I'd like just to get something in writing and some guidance. I mean, if that's the case, I think that should have been sent over weeks ago. If that, is the case, to confirm that, that's your position, is that you legally aren't allowed to do anything. The position on the savings plans is you're waiting to get the information. Those are two different things, and there hasn't been a lot of clarity or communication in any formal way with the council on these issues that need to be determined in the next few weeks. And these are weighty, serious issues that have major implications. And so I'd appreciate something sent over in writing and some confirmation from the council attorney to, agree with the county attorney's position on that or provide some other level of guidance. Last thing, we have been asking for about 3.5 weeks for tax fee, license, registration, other information of what was anticipated, what could be delayed. The state moved forward very quickly. The federal government moved forward very quickly on these things. Our neighboring jurisdictions have moved forward much more quickly than we have. And so far, we've heard literally nothing, that we are analyzing it. And it has caused significant concern in the public and with our business community and our residents. And it has caused a lot of frustration from colleagues and from myself. Do we have a timeline on that? We keep getting new dates. I mean, finally, we were told, I think last Wednesday we were supposed to hear, and then it was going to be Friday, and then now we're hearing nothing. I mean, what's the timeline on getting that, and when will it be shared with the public?
Sure. We have submitted to the governor's office the documentation to delay until the fall the tax sale for delinquent property tax accounts. As you may know, every county across the state goes through this process in the spring to put up to auction the properties that have delinquent bills on them. We have decided to delay that until the fall because, quite frankly, do you want to be running an auction right now? The courts are closed. Do you expect someone who's already delinquent in the property taxes to be able to pay up now? So that in itself is we usually bring in around $13 million a year.
How many properties are we talking about?
Well, there are probably 3,100 accounts that have some delinquent status to them. So,
but how many would go to auction that you'd be preventing from going to auction?
Well,
can't be thousands.
May I?
There is a process. Most properties wind up paying during the tax sale process because there are some people who don't even realize that they haven't paid their taxes. So
could Mr. Covey just say how many specific properties are we talking about that would be directly impacted by not being auctioned off?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Today there's about 3,800 properties that are slated for tax sale. By the time we get to tax sale, there's probably around 1,000 or so normally.
So we auction off 1,000 properties? Is that
we auction the tax liens on the properties, and over time, although almost every single one of them will be redeemed by the owner, and a handful, 5 to 10 or 12 over a 2-year period could be foreclosed on by the tax sale buyers. So
so we're talking about a handful of property. I mean, in reality here, we're talking about a handful of properties. I mean, I just have to be honest, this is totally inadequate as a response. It's not even the low-hanging fruit. Hold on, it's not even the low-hanging fruit. This is the fruit that's already dropped to the ground from the tree that you're picking up. And, while it's not a bad thing to delay, for that to be the response that we've been asking for almost a month in the middle of a crisis, as residents and businesses are desperately trying to figure out what their obligations are going to be, what their personal finances are looking like, whether or not they can keep the lights on at their businesses. This is just not an answer that I think is even remotely appropriate or acceptable to the moment that we're in. So if we could get a specific date on a final answer of exactly what license, fees, registrations, regulations, etc., will be delayed, will be forgiven, will be changed in light of the crisis that we're in, and when it will be shared with the public directly, I would appreciate it. And if you get it by the end of the week, by tomorrow, close of business, it doesn't seem unreasonable if you've been working on this for the past 3.5 weeks. I would appreciate that because, time is moving faster than it's ever moved right now for people, and it feels like we are not moving even remotely close to that in county government. And we need to demonstrate to the public that we understand what's happening in the real world.
Sure. I mean, one of the things you probably know in particular, working for the comptroller's office, is the comptroller, for example, has announced that sales tax receipts do not have to be remitted to the state until June 1st. So any retailer collecting sales tax for the month of February, March, and April doesn't have to turn over those dollars to the state until June 1st, even though in every case they are, to be clear, still collecting the sales tax. Every time you go to Target, every time you buy something that is subject to the sales tax, the consumer pays the sales tax. It's just the retailer gets to hold on to those tax receipts. Well, our two biggest parallels would be the energy tax and the telephone tax. As you pay your bill as a resident, you pay that tax that Pepco, for example, collects and then remits to us. Do you want to delay Pepco paying us the energy tax as a parallel to an action that the state took, when in fact they're billing people are paying the tax, Pepco is holding it, they can't commingle it with their dollars, they are holding it in escrow and they pay on a monthly basis to us. So do you want that delayed so that Pepco can hold on to that money, even though the individual consumer continues to pay the tax? So in many cases, from a tax standpoint, the individual business, the individual homeowner, consumer is still paying the tax, and we have no way to have them not pay the tax.
Can I just interrupt, please?
Sure.
I appreciate all the questions and I appreciate the answers, but we do, if possible, need to move on, please.
Yeah, I'm ready to move on. All I have to say is the time for asking those types of questions was 3 weeks ago. The time for getting actual answers is now, or actually yesterday. And if you could get us the answers and not just the questions, it would be greatly appreciated by the public, and it would be greatly appreciated by the council. Thank you, Mr.
I think we've answered that with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madalena. Thank you. I did want to ask Bob Drummer to please give a very quick synopsis of some information.
Sure, thank you. I can be real quick on this. Mr. Madaleno was partly correct in his statement about the collective bargaining agreements. It's true the county executive is required by law to recommend it in the agreements in his budget, but it's not true that he can't go back to the unions and renegotiate. He can go back to them and ask. If the unions say, no way, we're going to go with the agreements, then he's stuck with them. But he can go back and renegotiate, and I believe that did happen in 2009, 2010, where the executive went back and renegotiated the agreements before the council actually acted on them. But he does have to put it in the budget. But they're free to renegotiate at any time and go back, and as long as both parties are willing to do it. That's it.
Mr. President, could we just get in writing from the county attorney what was referenced at this meeting? Could we request that formally on behalf of the council?
Okay, thank you. We will do that. No, Councilmember Giwando.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate the presentation. I want to start by thanking our staff, Marlene and Craig, and the whole team. Thank you very much. This was very concise and helpful as far as the presentation, as usual. And, we are in, I think even more so, I know even more so than 2009 and 8 and 9. This is an unprecedented time. This is the most important budget and the most important year, 2020, I think, of our lifetimes. We don't know what's coming after, but I can certainly say for me, being in this position right now, having to make these decisions as a public servant on behalf of our county's residents as the country goes through a not seen in over 100 years global pandemic. We're on unprecedented, on shaky ice. All the metaphors apply here. We are in a position that none of us have ever been in. And while we can look to the past recessions, I think this is different because of the health crisis and because we're trying, number one, which I think is the role of any public servant, is to protect the lives and the safety of our residents, and then to protect their well-being, right, and to provide them services, particularly as a county government. How do we make sure we provide services? And we do so through a budget, through a statement of what we believe is important. Our schools, our roads, our recreation centers, our libraries, our parks. And so while I think the same services budget that was laid out is the right approach at this point, I agree with that. We have to always also realize that the same services budget in reality is a cut. And we all year since I've been on the council and even before as an advocate, we've talked about how much need there is in our community. And we just were talking about earlier this week the disparities that are showing their ugly head in the most horrible way. People dying because they don't have the same access and equal access to the services and healthcare and opportunities that we think everyone should have. And so we have to take all that in mind when we decide and make these critical budget decisions that if we seek to maintain a same services budget, realizing that means some people are still going to not have what they need, and that we should do everything we can to keep services to the maximum level possible while we're trying to recover, while being careful, while being fiscally prudent, but certainly for the most vulnerable among us, for our low income and our middle income residents who are squeezed already, as we try to recover from 10 or 20% unemployment, and we're doing what we can. This is the time to use a rainy day fund. This is the time to use reserves. This is the time to do things that we haven't done before to maintain the health, life, safety, welfare, and services that contribute to those things for our residents. So I just want to say, and I don't think this is inconsistent with what other people are saying, but as far as this council member, if we have to spend that money down for the next year to make sure that we help people recover, we should do it. And we'll build it back up over time. At the same time, we will work with, pressure, cajole, whatever the adjective you want to use, our federal delegation to do what they need to do to make sure that they are helping with an additional support package for states and localities. I know that's being discussed. Senator Van Hollen has been pushing very hard. It's caught up in politics, but we're in an election year, so that's going to happen. That's another reason this is such an important year. Literally everything is hanging in the balance. And so I think it would be imprudent of us to not provide that level of service and push for that, at least in this year's budget, until we know what's going to happen next year, realizing that we're going to be in a completely different world next year, no matter what happens with the election, with the virus, with everything that we're dealing with. So I just wanted to say that I think we need to keep that in mind. And we may have to spend down some of these reserve funds. Thankfully, we have them. But I think making cuts before we have a full picture of the financial situation, before we understand when the health crisis might be over and we might be able to start to reopen. The governor was talking about a plan, which I think is prudent to eventually reopen, even though we're not there yet. We need to move deliberately, keep services up, and make decisions as we go in the form of supplementals and savings plans once we understand more of the picture. So I just wanted to make that general statement, and I think the staff recommended approach is the right approach right now. And also we need to realize that still is going to have some people who were already suffering before this pandemic and not getting the service they need, even more will because of where we are. So we need to understand that that's where we're at. So I appreciate it, and I thank everyone for the work.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. The world has changed in 4 short weeks, especially here in Montgomery County, since the executive submitted his $5.9 billion budget to us. And as we look forward as we look towards working on that budget, I appreciate all the comments that my colleagues have shared during this conversation. And the fact that we have a rainy day fund. Some of you all, my colleagues who have been on this council for a term 2 or 2.5 or 3, depending on how we count it. I thank you. And I thank previous leadership across the board to make the tough decisions during those times to allocate important money that could have been used in that day, because there was no shortage 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago. But you all made the important decision to put it into a rainy day fund, and now's the time to use that fund in ways that we deem necessary and in prudent ways, in productive ways. Director Madaleno, I appreciate you being part of this conversation. I know folks have asked you questions, have shared their thoughts with you, but let me distill some of that into maybe 1 or 2 direct questions. When will, or if, let me rephrase that. When will the county executive submit a savings plan for this current budget if it's necessary? And when will the county executive share his thoughts on a revised FY21 budget?
Mr. Manalino, if you could answer that.
I was waiting. I didn't believe I had control over over clicking in. I'm sorry about that. Sorry, my apologies about unmuting. I thought Ms. Parsons had to control who could speak and when. When it comes to the time frame on the savings plan, we are waiting to see the third quarter analysis, which will be finished, as I mentioned, it should be finished by tomorrow and transmitted to you on Monday. We need to figure out, and we're still waiting for guidance from the federal government and the state to make some distribution decisions about federal funds, which will allow us to fill in holes in the budget and in some cases back out appropriations, like the explanation I gave to Councilmember Friedson about the transit relief dollars that are in the giant $2 trillion relief bill. So I can't give you that sort of deadline because I can't give you a date certain as to when we're going to transmit that. My goal would be by the end of the month if we have all of the guidance from the federal government. We are working hard to also send over information about the $183 million, how that might be used. I think Ms. Michelson talked about that in her presentation as far as coming up with an outline of a plan and giving you some space to be obviously involved in determining where that money goes, recognizing that $183 million is not just for FY20, but is actually available to all state and local governments for expenditures from March 1st to December. As far as revisions to the FY21 budget, I think as you heard a little bit from Councilmember Gelando and his comments, the county executive continues to stand by his approach to fully fund the school system's request. Councilmember Rice was talked about MCPS and Montgomery College wanting to work to alter their budget requests. We have not received any formal transmission from MCPS about a change in their budget request. I totally get that they are understanding of where the fiscal condition of the country, the world, the county. So, but the county executive is a firm believer in us continuing to think about the future and the future of our community through the school system, addressing the achievement gap, some of the things that clearly the MCPS budget request had factored in. So recognizing that when we talk about the property tax increase, almost all of that property tax increase was dedicated solely for the school system. If you do not want to move forward, if your choice is a maintenance of effort only budget, then the need for that supplemental property tax rate for education goes away, since it wasn't, that property tax increase was not predicated on funding the operations of county government or any of the other parts of county government, really, except for MCPS. So if the decision, as you have signaled in that resolution, is just maintenance of effort, then obviously your decision to not move forward with that additional spending for MCPS would be obviously final. As far as other revisions to that,
can I, we're running a long time here. We're an hour over, and I appreciate the answers, but go ahead, please.
I appreciate the time check, but the reality is we're trying to figure out how to move forward here. And I'm asking for the county executive's approach, which hasn't really been asked during this conversation. I appreciate all the thoughts that my colleagues have, all important ones and spot on, but I'm asking for their roadmap instead of directing him to adopt my roadmap. So I'm intently listening to him, and we are going to hold them, Director Matalino and the county executive, to fulfill what they're at least saying in terms of their timeline. But we can continue this conversation. You've given us a few inflection points about when we're getting money from the federal government and some other factors that we need to take into account, just like MCPS, just like Montgomery College. I acknowledge that and appreciate that. Now let me just pivot to one last thought. Earlier this week on Tuesday, we had an interview with the prospective director of the Department of Permitting Services. And one of the major themes that came out of that conversation was reorganizing and making sure that DPS is more efficient. And I want to broaden that out to say that if we're going to get through this with the fiscal reality that is before us, we need to make sure that we find efficiencies across the board throughout all of county government. And I'm not quite sure that any of those ideas have been shared from the executive side in the last 15 or 16 months. Lots of talk about it, but I think now is the time to start proposing, either on your side or on our side, ways to make our leaner government work for everybody. And we're lean, not necessarily by choice, but we have to be right now. That's the fiscal reality. I know that when we went through the recession nearly a decade ago, the county executive Leggett at that point put together a commission to try and figure out what efficiencies could be made here in Montgomery County, and that manifested itself in a report in 2010, the Montgomery County Organizational Reform Commission. I have to dust it off. I'm not quite exactly sure what recommendations are in that, but I think we need a 2.0 version, at least begin the conversation. And I'm not pledging myself or anybody else to enacting clearly what those recommendations were. Quite frankly, I said I need to dust it off and have a refresher course, but that's the type of thinking that we need. And so I appreciate your commitment to sharing budget revisions with us, be it the budget revisions for the FY21, be it the savings plan for this budget, and as I just said, coming up with ways to make our government more efficient so that we can work within the fiscal constraints that this pandemic has put upon us. And I look forward to working with you and all my colleagues to do right by all the residents, making sure they have all the services they need and deserve, but also recognizing the taxpayer dollars that go into our $5.8, $5.9 billion budget. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Councilmember Glass. And I wanted to be clear, I was not questioning your questions. I sincerely appreciated your questions. I was hoping that the answers could be a little bit more succinct. That's where I was. And with that, Councilmember Raymer, please.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we need to get savings plans from the executive branch immediately, and we need the departments to begin reviewing how they can save money immediately. And every week that passes that we're not actively putting savings plans in place is just making it more difficult when we take action down the road. So, I think that what we need is the county executive to put this into motion and direct his departments to begin to prepare that information for us. And it feels like we're sort of stuck here where the executive is continuing to advocate for his proposed budget rather than putting into motion the executive branch figuring out how to deal with the crisis from a budget and fiscal perspective. I say that saying we're here to talk about the budget. This is a distinct conversation. We are all working together on our response to the COVID-19 health emergency. But we are here to talk about the budget and the fiscal planning. And so there's going to have to be, a conversation that is not sugar-coated. It's just unavoidable. But, to the extent that we're seeking the executive branch to recommend tax delays or waivers, let's acknowledge that the present advocacy by the executive branch is for a tax increase. That's where we're at right now. So we need to get this operation working. I think we need to return to the committee process. It seems to me we've figured out the technology now. It's functional. And I think it could be very helpful to drive this process forward, to take up specific areas of the county government through committee review. And we need to make a quick decision on the compensation packages. What happened in the past, the reason why there was such a difficult series of decisions that had to be made was that over a number of years, compensation rose much faster than revenues. Compensation was going up 10, 12 points a year, 12 percentage points a year, and revenues weren't growing that fast. They were growing quite fast during the real estate bubble, but they weren't growing that fast. The budget that we received last year restarted that kind of compensation growth, and I think the submission this year has done that again, and we've had to wrestle with that problem. But so I understand our next council session will be more focused on compensation, and we'll get into that at that time. But I just think we've got to, Mr. Drummer said that the county executive can request to reopen bargaining at any time. It sounds like that request has not been made. So the posture of the executive branch is keep the tax increase, keep the compensation as bargained, and give it all to the council to sort it out. I don't think that's the right way to do this. I think that the executive ought to put in place and put in motion making the decisions and provide that leadership. So again, I do want to say I think we need to re-engage the committee process, and I think anywhere a department can. I thought Councilmember Albernoz made a great point about swimming pools, rec programs generally. We may have a much reduced schedule of rec programs this year. Community centers, when will they reopen? Like all of these things, we could at least start to figure out when and how to save funding. And the sooner we act, the better. Final point I want to make about the fiscal issues overall and I appreciated Councilmember Glass's comments about, the decisions that have been made to set aside that funding. The funding is there because the revenues are going to decline. So it's to enable us to get through a period of reduced revenue. Yes, that supports spending, but let's not think of it as a fund that we now have to spend. Rather, it's a buffer. It's a protection against declining revenues. So we need to better understand the revenues and how much they're going to decline in order to understand, how that will match against our spending obligations. And certainly we need to get a better sense of this federal funding that's available. I think we're all trying to understand that. I know everyone is working hard, but that will be a big factor. So hopefully we can get some answers there very soon, and as much funding as we can push into that. Of course, we're going to want to spend every penny that we have available there, and that will be very helpful to get through this year. Thanks.
Thank you. And let me just say about the committee work, because we are doing everything remotely, we would have to have additional staff come into the office building to do committee work, and that is a concern. So the reason we're doing everything at this point, you're saying we've got the technology down. We haven't even had a public hearing yet using this technology. We will try that this afternoon and try that this evening, and hopefully it will work without flaws. But as you know, with technology, the hopes do not always happen. So we're far away from committee work at this point. And the next speaker is Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And, maybe my microphone wasn't working. Maybe Mr. Madaleno wasn't listening when I spoke. I never said that the school system nor Montgomery College was going to be advocating for reducing the budget. I was very explicit in terms of saying they understand that that's where we are, understanding that they're not going out and soliciting, saying, hey, we're giving up money, but certainly are there. I would hope that leadership, both in the financial department and in the executive branch, would reach out and have the same conversations that the chair of the Education and Culture Committee is with department heads about cost savings and understanding how they may be able to enact to ensure that while Montgomery County has reached over 35,000 unemployment claims, we can talk about how we can reduce our budget accordingly, understanding that there will be draws on so many other avenues within. This does not need to be a tit for tat. This does not need to be an argument. This does not need to be an us versus them. That is destructive, divisive, and is counterproductive to what it is that we are trying to do. And so I hope, Mr. Madaleno, that with your responses in the future, that they're really focused on getting us more together instead of trying to pit us against each other, because that's not helpful to anyone, and that's not what anybody's looking for. The reality is, in this whole thing, is that our constituents are looking for a united voice when it comes to what it is that we're going to do to get us through this pandemic. It is not going to be a separation. It is not going to work if the county executive is saying one thing and the council is saying another. We have to get together on this. We see that dysfunction at the national level, and we pride ourselves locally on making sure that we are different. So let's show that we're different. Let's show that we're working together. And before we make comments like this, of where, oh, well, this is where the executive is and the council can do whatever it wants, let's make sure that we pause and think about what that effect has on our overall constituency. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Albernoz.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I know we're way over. Just a couple questions with regards to timing. So it's April 16th, and understandably, the executive branch, there are a lot of floating pieces that are difficult to pin down before they can provide a very clear savings plan, but also roadmap for the next fiscal year. I respect all that. But it is April 16th. And so I guess my question for council staff or the executive branch is, we're very, per our charter, limited in time and scope. Are there any provisions in an emergency as we are in now to make any sort of adjustments to that calendar, acknowledging this unprecedented time that we're in? And if it's not, then we can't wait for the federal government. And if we do and hold our breath there, then help us all, because they have certainly not demonstrated that they have their act together. And so we're going to have to make assumptions which are not going to be perfect and will likely lead to herky-jerky savings plans as happened 10 years ago, but we're doing the best with the information we have. So that's my first question, is the timing of all of this. Is there any flexibility there, or are we completely and totally bound by the time constraints as laid out by the charter and in policy?
And if I could ask Mr. Madaleno, before you answer, please keep your answers succinct. We're way over time.
Thank you. It comes from having spent 12 years in a legislative body with a filibuster. I'm sorry that
Well, hopefully it won't. You don't have to start today again.
I'm a little long-winded. So, naturally occurring savings are happening. The county executive put in a hiring freeze and a procurement freeze a month ago. So please don't think that the absence of a savings plan doesn't mean that we aren't taking significant actions across county government to make sure we are saving money in order to make sure we come in as balanced as possible. So there will be some items that we have to send over, but without, and certainly Councilmember Alber knows, you remember this as a department director, without positions being filled across the board, that is resulting in savings that you will see reflected in the third quarter analysis, but that don't need a savings plan to realize those savings.
But and in terms of timing, whether you can answer that or council central staff, is there any flexibility there?
I'll ask Bob Drummer to jump in. June 1st is the date we are required to adopt the budget. So our May 21st date before Memorial Day, in theory, could be moved back a week. I'm not sure how much more we would know in that time frame and whether there would be any benefit. What we have heard is that the federal government expects to try and get money out to jurisdictions within a month. I don't know if that'll really happen. If it's close and we think there's some benefit to having that, reflected in year-end reserves or something, we might come back to you. But I'm not sure. Bob, are you there? And can you talk about the legal issue?
Well, the June 1st date is in the June 1st date. Pushing on different buttons here. The June 1st date is in the charter. We can't change that. That's the date we have to. I think it may also be in this. I'm not positive. It may be in the State Enabling Act too, but it's definitely in the charter. We can't change the date we have to adopt the budget by. And we can't change when the fiscal year starts. It starts July 1. So we're stuck with those dates, but we do have a lot of flexibility to make changes in the budget after we enact it with supplementals and savings plans and things like that. But we have to do something by June 1st.
Thank you. And that leads me to my last point. I want to thank Councilmember Glass. The Councilmember Navarro and I were shaking our heads because we both remember the document that you were referring to. And I do think that it is wise for us to dust off the playbook that was used, admittedly not perfect, but we can at least start that as a baseline for lessons learned and a roadmap for how to work collaboratively and quickly over the next month and a half to get all of this done. Thank you.
And I just will mention one of our staff members have already went to pull it out. It was called the Organizational Reform Commission, or ORC. And so the staff member has said, and this is Dr. Torregas, that it's time for ORC to breach. And so we'll be looking at it and let you know what we think might be there that would be relevant.
Thank you very much. And I'm not surprised that Dr. Tregas is already looking into it. Thank you. That concludes, unless staff has anything else to add, that concludes this topic for the moment. Is that, yes, we're okay? And then we're going to go into, or let me do a time check. We're about an hour and 15 minutes over our time schedule here for the CIP discussion. About how long do you think that's going to take, and should we continue it now or continue it later? What should we do?
Yeah, my suggestion would be to continue it. I think a lot of the comments that you've made are relevant to the CIP as well. So
I think that's correct.
I think Glenn and Keith, would you agree that we should continue, and they could probably do that in a shorter period of time?
Yeah, I think we can move expeditiously through it.
Okay. Well, let's begin, please.
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Sydney?
I can.
I'm referring to the agenda item number 3, council staff report. It's only a couple of pages, and I think we can move through it fairly quickly. A lot of the obviously overarching fiscal issues have already been discussed in the earlier item. We will touch on a couple here, but for the most part, what we're trying to do is get us through the CIP process. Unlike the operating budget process, the council was partially through its initial review of the CIP before things basically shut down last month. So what we're looking at is how to restart the council review process for the CIP, get us through what we need to. As you heard earlier, we have the June 1 deadline on the operating budget and also on the CIP. And we have to do that with no committee work sessions. So we're looking at a schedule starting next week of restarting the CIP process. We were going to start the next council session with the items that were on the council agenda for March 17th, and we're ready to go because those are the quickest to turn around. And then after that, follow that with the additional items that need to be done on April 23rd to the degree we can find some items that are ready for that date. And then probably the bulk of the items on the following week, the 28th and the 30th of April, so that we can complete the council's initial review of all of the CIP projects by the end of April. We also do have the executive's recommended additions, changes to the FY 21 through 26 CIP that came over on March 16th. And those had not been reviewed by the council yet. The only items that have been through the council since then were some FY 19 through 24 CIP supplementals and amendments. So we are handling those since those were more timely and had to be done. But all of the other items that the executive had in his March 16th transmittal also need to be brought back to the council. Some of those items were in items the council already, or areas the council already addressed. So you'll see some familiar departments coming back, and others are in departments that had not been reviewed yet, so they'll be folded into those. So that's the intent with the schedule. Then, once we're through the council reviews of all of the remaining budgets, staff's recommendation is that we provide an early May status update to the council. The reason for early May is first, we'll have all of the budgets reviewed. We'll have some sense of where the numbers are on the expenditure side. But also, we're hoping to have more information on the revenue side, at least more than we have now, especially with regard to issues like recordation tax and impact tax, since those are pretty important revenues on the CIP side and could significantly affect reconciliation. So we want to have the latest information we can on those and where those are headed, and if there's any changes from the council's spending affordability assumptions earlier this year. So that will be wrapped up into it. Also, we are still working with OMB and with MCPS to better understand state aid for school construction. Both the upcoming year, where there's still some outstanding issues, but even more so FY22 and beyond, where the General Assembly enacted pretty sweeping legislation that gives the counties like ours a significant opportunity to seek additional state aid in those years. But there's a lot of caveats to that and local match issues that we have to work through to figure out what we think we can afford to be eligible for, especially in the next couple of years, and what to assume in those out years. So that's something also that we hope to have better information by early May. So by the early May timeframe, hopefully we'll be able to provide a good status report for the council on where we are and begin the reconciliation process. Unlike past years, the reconciliation process could be a bit more substantive in terms of adjustments that need to be made. We already know we have some expenditure gaps. As the executive has done in past years, we have a significant affordability reconciliation project in the MCPS CIP that has to be filled or solved by the council. Hopefully the state aid will help with some of that, but we know there's going to be some gaps to fill there, especially in the first couple of years. And then we also have some other issues that were alluded to earlier. What do we do about PAYGO and current revenue, given the uncertainty on the operating budget? And staff's perspective there is that it would be useful for us to develop a scenario on the capital side that assumes zero PAYGO in FY21, in the first year of the CIP, to give the council some flexibility. Now, this is something that the council can decide later in this budget process if it wants to pursue that, but I think we at least need to keep that option open going forward. Also, on the current revenue side, staff will look at areas where current revenue could be trimmed back. We have about $57 million in current revenue in the CIP, in the executive's recommended CIP. So as part of reconciliation, we will be looking at opportunities there perhaps as well. So with that, I think that's sort of a quick summary of how we intend to get through the CIP process over the next month. If council members have any questions, I know Glenn Orland, Dr. Orland is on the call with us today and can also answer some questions, especially if there's questions about how things were done in the past, since he's been doing this process for many years and I'm transitioning to it this year. And also any other process questions that folks may have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Orland, did you have anything to add?
No, I don't. I think Keith gave a very good summary of it. The only other thing I'd mention is that we're hoping that we will get from finance, working with our staff, what the newer revenue assumptions will be for recordation taxes as well as impact taxes, because that'll have an effect both on FY20 and FY21. But Keith covered everything else perfectly.
Well, as was predicted, we have no council members who are weighing in on this issue. I think everybody sort of spoke on both issues on the first topic. So thank you very, very much for giving us the information, and we will be obviously continuing our work on the topic. So thank you. And with that, we're going to call a recess, and we will be back at 1:30 to try our very, very best to start the public hearing process. Hopefully it will be a smooth sailing, but we won't know until we start it. Thank you. We are adjourned.